Now we move on to gas, an overview of the gas industry in Australia. Well, Steve Davies is with us. Steve's a policy advisor for the Australian Pipeline Industry Association. What does a policy advisor for that association do? Well, he responds to government policy initiatives on behalf of the pipeline owners and operators. He articulates the industry position to government, in other words. Steve wants you to really turn your attention to gas and think about what you can do for the gas industry, particularly the training providers. Steve, I think it's fair to say, is passionate about gas. Here he is, Steve Davies.
Thank you very much, Phil, and thank you very much, EOS, for having me here today, and thank you everyone who's stayed to listen to this presentation. I'm not delusional. I know that most of you are involved in the training sector for electricity and you don't have a great interest in the gas industry. So I've done what I can to make this as interesting and relevant for you guys today. And look, one thing that is important is EOS is Energy Skills Australia. I think that's a great rebranding and a good reminder that the gas industry in particular is a part of EOS, and the National Gas Training Package is one of the 4 training packages that EOS manages. And something we have found when we look to import units from electricity packages, particularly those sort of higher level, more generic units of competency, is when there are references to electricity in them, it's very hard for us to import them, or we have to request of a certain TAC that changes are made. So just something to keep in mind when you are thinking in your TACs about some of those more high level generic units. The gas industry is a part of EOS, and if you can avoid using the word electricity and sometimes maybe just use the word energy instead, it can make us easier to sort of cross-pollinate the training packages, and that's certainly something in the gas training package that we're conscious of trying to keep the units that can be generic as generic as possible so that they can be used by other industries. Look, I'm also aware that this is the last presentation of the day and that most of us are on East Coast time, so I'm feeling it. I will try and do this as quickly as possible too. What I'd like to talk today about is just a few different things that should be of interest. The gas supply chain and how that works. Some of the major points of difference between the gas industry and the electricity industry. The Australian context for gas, where is the gas and how much do we use and those kind of things. Some of the big issues for the Australian gas market, and then the training and workforce issues from my perspective. And I guess I should note that being from the Australian Pipeline Industry Association, we represent the gas transmission industry, so that is what I tend to focus on. Of course, there's the gas distribution industry, the LPG industry are also represented in the training package, and there's also an upstream gas industry as well. So it's a pretty broad, diverse industry involved in getting gas to consumers, and probably a bit of what I'm going to say is slanted towards the transmission pipeline issues, but I have made some effort to keep it as general as possible. So looking at the gas supply chain, before we get into that slide, I should note that there are 2 types of gas that are really in main use in Australia. There's natural gas, which is delivered to everyone through pipelines and distribution networks. That's what I'm mostly focused in. That's natural gas. Sometimes in America in particular it's called pipeline gas because that's how it comes to you. The other main form of gas is LPG, liquefied petroleum gas, which in America they would call bottle gas. And so that is the main distinguishing feature. It tends to be used in applications where the distribution network isn't available. So in sort of more remote areas in particular, rural fringes of cities that aren't connected to distribution networks, and of course in the transportation industry, LPG it has pretty wide acceptance from taxis and in vehicles as well. There are some chemical differences between the two. Natural gas is not usually pure methane, but it is heavily biased towards methane, sort of CH4, and the liquid LPG is up in the sort of heavier hydrocarbon gases, C3 and above, so it does have some higher energy content, so you get more energy per bottle of gas. But looking at the natural gas supply chain, it starts off with production. So on the left side of the screen, you see the wells and the offshore platforms. That's where all of the gas that we produce comes from. In Australia, we don't have to import any natural gas, sorry. We do import LPG, but we are 100% self-sufficient, and we have a pretty big export industry as well. in natural gas, and that is growing substantially. So that upstream industry is analogous in the electricity industry to the generation sector, but it is substantially different. Oil and gas exploration and production companies are some of the biggest in the world, the major players. They're highly entrepreneurial and speculative. It's a high risk business with big rewards when you do pay off, which is quite different to generation, which is selling into regulated wholesale markets. You make investment decisions and then you produce the electricity yourself. You don't have to go and find electricity. You might locate your generator strategically in terms of what kind of fuel you're using to generate electricity, but there's quite a lot of difference between the gas producing sector and the electricity producing sector. Then once gas is produced, as it comes out of the ground, it's not suitable for use. It needs to go into processing and treatment plants where water is stripped out, carbon dioxide is stripped out, oil, condensate, gas, LPG, all of these things are separated and taken off for their various uses. The natural gas that we use then goes into a transmission pipeline. These are the pipelines that connect production centres with demand centres, and in Australia they tend to be very long by world standards and very skinny. There's not massive amounts of gas being used here, so our diameter of pipelines tend to be in we use inches for the most part, in 16 to 28 inches. In Europe and North America you'd often find pipelines up in above 40 inches. And some of the new pipelines that we're seeing to take gas into Gladstone for the LNG facilities in Queensland will be up at that mark, 40-inch size or above, taking in substantial quantities of gas to those export facilities. Some major customers will be connected directly to transmission pipelines, often mines, large industrials and power generators would all be connected directly to transmission pipelines. It's not a particularly easy process or a straightforward process. The gas in transmission pipelines is at very high pressures, typically 8 megapascals and above, and so to bring it down to a usable pressure it's not just a simple matter of tapping into a transmission pipeline and your customer can go away and be happy. It's a fairly significant process to depressurise it or lower the pressure to what it can be used at. And then at the end of a transmission pipeline, you'll have a city gate where the gas is again lowered in pressure. Usually an odorant will be added for injection into distribution network. So the smell that you associate with natural gas is not actually a natural smell for natural gas. That's added for safety reasons so that people in their homes can be aware of leaks. And then, of course, in the distribution network, you have your commercial users, your residential users. Natural gas has some transport use as well. We see quite a few bus fleets in capital cities running on compressed natural gas. There's some interest in creating a heavy vehicle fleet using compressed natural gas, and there's some interesting technology being developed in Australia to that end at the moment. So that's really an overview of the natural gas supply chain. From the LPG side of things, it's a bit different. It's not typically transported by pipeline in Australia. It is largely put straight into vessels, gaseous vessels, and transported around by truck. So a lot of it is imported on the east coast in particular, and then put on truck and transported to users around the country. So the major points of difference really between the electricity industry and the gas industry, there's a few. The first one is the physical differences. Gas is a physical commodity. There are molecules of gas you put in, or you pull out of the ground, you put in one end of a pipeline, and those same molecules come out the other end. So straight away that creates quite a bit of differences in how markets work, but it also means there's quite a few differences. So gas is easy to store. The length of transmission pipelines in Australia means, in effect, they are used as large storage bottles. That's obviously quite different to electricity, where you need batteries and it's quite difficult to store electricity on a large scale. So the gas has a flow, it's compressible. We pressurise the pipelines to push it from one end to the other. And it's really easy to track whose gas is there. You obviously can't track individual molecules, but you know who's put gas in one end of a pipeline, and then they pull it out the other end of the pipeline, which is quite different to how electricity networks work. There's obvious locational differences. We don't get to choose where the gas comes from. So our production centres are based on all sorts of geological factors that I don't really understand, and that's a reality we deal with. Then we have to transport the gas to where it's used, so that's quite different for electricity, where power generators, for the most part, can choose where to place those power stations. Obviously, in the case of coal-fired power stations, they're going to be as close to coal mines as possible, but for various other forms of power generation, there are quite a bit more locational opportunities or options that they can consider. In terms of market operation, the physical characteristics of gas and electricity have led us to have two completely different markets, which is appropriate. Obviously all electricity is produced and put into, in the case of the East Coast, the national electricity market, which is centrally managed and operated by the Australian Energy Market Operator, with dispatches every 5 minutes and power stations being told to ramp up and ramp down and being directed as to how much they're allowed to produce based on the bid stack, whereas gas is pretty much all entirely run by bilateral negotiation and contracts. So a major gas user has to arrange for a gas supply from a gas producer, has to arrange for a transportation contract with a gas transmission company, and then has to give directions to both of those every day on how much gas it wants and where that gas will come from and the timing of delivery and those kind of things. So large users really do manage their own gas supply, which is quite different for electricity. If you're a smaller user, then one of the major retailers will take care of all of that for you and provide you with your gas supply. But it has meant that in the case of electricity, where you have this centrally run market overseen by the government, there's an awful lot of transparency. Everyone knows, for the most part, what's going on. Obviously, some electricity or a fair amount of electricity is traded under contract, where the terms of those contracts aren't really known, but there's a wholesale price for electricity. Electricity infrastructure has regulated tariffs that aren't charged directly to most customers. They have to be recovered through the electricity price, whereas the owners of gas infrastructure and the producers of gas infrastructure have much more direct relationships with the major users and retailers of gas. So that is quite different. And then that also means that investment in gas and electricity is quite different. Gas is far more entrepreneurial, is probably the right word for it, compared to electricity, which particularly in the infrastructure space is a lot more planned, with again, the Australian Energy Market Operator producing statements of opportunities and approving certain or having a list of pre-approved investments that anyone can make that will be allowed to earn regulated revenue, whereas particularly for gas transmission pipelines, usually our customers come to us and tell us what their gas needs are going to be for the future. They have to have already secured a gas supply themselves, and then the gas transmission company will try to get enough users together at once to justify building a new pipeline or expanding a pipeline and putting that steel in the ground. And the final big difference, or the area where there is quite a bit of difference, is in the end-use markets. I'm more familiar with the gas usage statistics, but I think for electricity, about 55 to 60% of it is used in residential and commercial applications. So that's fairly static demand. People have to have electricity in their houses. Businesses need electricity to operate all their systems and computers and make money. Whereas in gas, only about 15% of gas demand is from residential and commercial users. The vast majority of gas is used in power generation, manufacturing, and in the mining sector. So gas fortunes tend to rise and fall a bit more with some of the various sectors of the economy, and sort of some pipelines in particular are entirely dependent on mine sites. That's all they supply. So as commodity prices go up, their fortunes rise, and when commodity prices goes down, less gas is used too. So it's a bit more volatile, and that does also vary from pipeline to pipeline and production centre to production centre as well. Looking at the transmission pipelines around the country, look, the names of the pipelines and the details of the pipelines aren't particularly important, but it might be interesting for you to understand where the gas comes from that we use. So in Western Australia, the vast majority of the gas comes from the North West Shelf, A lot of that is exported, but then you've got the big pipelines bringing it down. One on the coast, the Dampier to Bunbury pipeline, bringing it to Perth. That's the biggest pipeline in the country, both by length and volume of gas that's coming down through there. Then you've got the Goldfields pipeline going all the way down to Esperance and supplying a whole bunch of mines as it goes on. In the Northern Territory, you've got the Amadeus pipeline linking Darwin to Alice Springs. 30 years ago, that was built to take gas from this region to Darwin and was the main source of Darwin's energy supply. Things have changed. Now all of Darwin's gas comes from offshore, and that pipeline actually flows gas down to Alice Springs now. So I think things have changed substantially there. In the centre, you've got Moomba and the gas fields of the Cooper Basin, which have long been a traditional source of gas for eastern markets, particularly South Australia and New South Wales. They take gas from the Moomba to Adelaide pipeline and the Moomba to Sydney pipeline. We're not that original in how we name our pipelines for the most part, both supplying gas to capital cities. And now there is also a link across to the Queensland gas fields, which has only actually been built in the last 3 or 4 years. I think that pipeline went into commission about 3 years ago. It'll be interesting to see how gas does end up coming out of Queensland. Obviously, there's an awful lot of activity in the coal seam gas space in Queensland, which is a resource that has really ballooned substantially over the last 8 years, really. It's probably been on the radar, but probably only in the last 4 or 5 years has it really been understood exactly how much gas is there, how much demand is going to be generated by the new export industry. And actually there's going to be quite a bit of issue in getting enough gas out of the ground to feed all of those LNG facilities in Gladstone in the short term. And then you've also got the southeast, the fields of the Otway Basin and the Bass Strait that have always been the traditional suppliers of Victoria, and they also in the last decade have had pipelines going into South Australia and New South Wales as well from there, and also in the very late 1990s, a pipeline was built to Tasmania. Just quickly on the representation of the gas industry, I mentioned that there's the upstream industry, the producers and explorers, there's the transmission industry, there's the distribution industry, there's the retail end. At the retail end, electricity and gas tends to be indistinguishable, and the same companies sell equally gas and electricity to their customers. The distribution side of things, connecting homes and businesses to electricity and gas networks, there's quite a lot of commonality there, and both of those industries are represented by the Energy Networks Association. I've touched on the differences between the gas transmission industry and the electricity industry. So the gas transmission industry is solely represented by the Australian Pipeline Industry Association, and the producers and explorers have quite different interests to the rest of the gas industry, and they're represented by the Petroleum Production and Exploration Association. So having a think about gas in Australia, the first thing that we think about in gas is reserves. How much gas do we know is in the ground in Australia? And this map's a little bit old right now, but the numbers don't change that drastically. The coal seam gas numbers have been all over the place and are always anticipated to be very high. But look, in reality, we've got pretty clearly over 400 years of reserves at current usage rates. That's the domestic usage rate. So there's a lot of gas in the ground in Australia. It's not all really easy to get because it is underground. The petroleum industry never knows exactly how much resources it has until a well stops producing, really. You don't actually know, so you have to base these things on probabilities and best guesses, but they have made that into a pretty exact science. The big thing to note, I guess, is for particularly the east coast of Australia, the traditional sources of gas, Central Australia around Moomba and in the Bass Strait, those reserves are well and truly in the decline. We're pretty undeniable that their best days are behind them, and there's not as much gas to be produced anymore. The coal seam gas in Queensland has come along at a very opportune time. There's always been quite a bit of consideration about where is the future gas coming from on the east coast of Australia. Up until 6 or 7 years ago, most pipeline maps would have had a dotted line from Papua New Guinea coming down to Queensland, and the PNG pipeline was a sure thing for a few years there to bring the gas that we need, and coal seam gas has well and truly meant that we don't need to worry about that. So where all that gas ends up going and how much of it gets exported is a topic that we could easily spend more than 25 minutes on, but there is enough gas in Australia for gas to play a big role in Australia's energy mix for another 100 years quite easily. In terms of local demand, one of the things that we do in the gas industry, for the most part, the domestic gas industry talks about petajoules. We sell gas by the gigajoule, but the demand is sufficient that we think about it in terms of petajoules. You might have noticed on the last slide, it referred to all of the reserves on a volume basis, trillion cubic feet. A lot of the measurements in the oil and gas industry are based on American units of measurement. So the upstream industry talks about trillion cubic feet. The government will often talk about billion cubic metres. And then when we talk about gas and gas usage, we talk about petajoules and the actual energy content. And that is how gas is sold and used. So the big users are electricity generation. 35% of all gas goes into electricity generation, and that varies quite substantially state by state. In both South Australia and Western Australia, over 50% of their electricity comes from gas-fired power stations, whereas New South Wales and Victoria, it's well under 10%. Manufacturing, another third of gas, and that's used as both an input to chemical processes, so fertiliser manufacturing and sort of high-value chemicals are manufactured from natural gas directly, and also as a heat source in sort of brick kilns for melting glass, all sorts of things, smelting, those kind of applications. So it's both an energy and an input to manufacturing processes. And then the mining sector uses quite a bit of gas as an energy. If you're a remote mine site, it's usually quite a bit easier to get gas to your mine. Gas tends to be remote as well. They're often co-located, or the pipelines have been built to meet the demand. So it's easier for remote mines to get gas than be connected to the electricity grid. And then that remaining 15% is residential, commercial, transport and storage. So in terms of export, at the moment we export about as much as we use domestically. We use domestically about 1,100 petajoules and we're exporting about 1,000 petajoules. Australian LNG is highly regarded in the Asia Pacific in particular, so we sell a lot to Japan, Korea, Taiwan, starting to sell quite a bit to China. Australia is a big exporter of LNG, up at sort of, I think we're currently about third, and if all of the current projects go ahead, we'll be second, if not first. A lot of the LNG exporting countries don't have as open markets as we do in Australia, so countries like Japan and Korea are happy to do business in Australia. Indonesia and Qatar are big exporters as well, and those governments there have tended to be a bit fickle in the past, and we're happy to cancel contracts or renegotiate contracts on more favourable terms if the whim takes them, essentially. And it was only a few years ago that Indonesia stopped exporting LNG without any real warning, and said that future reserves of gas will be kept for Indonesian use. So that again makes Australia a popular source of LNG, and we see that from the kind of facilities that are going in Gladstone in Queensland. The federal government is very fond of talking about $150 billion worth of investment in the pipeline. That's a cliche that's being used quite a bit at the moment. When something's in the pipeline, I guess that means it's a sure thing. It's already been put in one end. It's definitely going to come out the other end. So it's good to be working for an industry that is associated with a positive cliche. But at the same time, that's really all people think about pipelines. When the government's talking about pipelines, it tends to be about an investment pipeline. And I have fond thoughts of a big pipeline just spewing money out one end, but that would be sweet. So in terms of pipelines, we have about 28,000 kilometres of high-pressure steel pipelines in Australia. And I've mentioned traditionally in that 16 to 28-inch diameter, with some larger diameter pipelines being built for the Queensland Export Project. So they tend to be long, skinny pipelines, we would say, by international standards. And sort of looking at the map, you can see that the production centres are quite a long way from the coastal capital cities. Distribution, there's around 130,000 kilometres of distribution pipelines in the ground, steel and PE pipe. And the gathering networks for CSG is going to see tens of thousand kilometres of PE pipe being put in to connect all these coal seam gas wells into big trunk lines. So that is a big growth industry for gas in Australia. Something I want to spend a little bit of time on is just trying to say or give an understanding of the relevance of the gas industry. When people talk about gas, they tend to think, oh yeah, it'd be nice to have gas in the home, it's good for cooking and responsive and those kind of things, but it's not really considered as a major part of the energy mix. It's often referred to, it's 20% of primary energy, which sort of says it's reasonably important but not as important as some of the other energy sources. But the reality is the amount of gas used in Australia last year was 1,130 petajoules. So about 390 petajoules of that went into electricity production, and the other 740 petajoules was used for energy, and about 100 odd petajoules of it was used for manufacturing inputs. And the entire amount of electricity generation in the national electricity market, so we're just looking at the East Coast, we're not considering Northern Territory or Western Australia here, was 738 petajoules, or it was 203 terawatt hours, which has an energy value of 738 petajoules. And about 20% of that was actually produced from gas. So in terms of energy delivered to the economy, gas is doing a pretty good job. If you consider the West Australian electricity and Northern Territory markets, we'll change the numbers a bit. So it's roughly equivalent. Gas provides as much usable electricity to the economy, as much usable energy to the economy as electricity does, but it's not nearly as high on the radar, I think, in most people's minds. And sure, you can't run a TV with gas, but you can do a whole lot of things with gas that you might not think about. Obviously, it's all about heating for the most part. So in the home, you can heat water, you can do your cooking, you can heat space, but there's also gas-fired air conditioning units available, mostly. It makes sense at an industrial scale, but when you think about the rising and the big current focus on rising electricity prices and the time and effort and money that's put into managing peak demand of electricity, which is largely driven by air conditioning on hot days, there's a real opportunity for the gas industry to make more of an effort in that air conditioning space. On those hot days when electricity demand and air conditioning demand is quite high, you also find that the gas networks aren't being used all that much because people aren't heating their houses, they don't need to heat much hot water, and they'd be more inclined to have a barbecue outside than do cooking inside. So there's an opportunity to utilise the existing gas infrastructure to help with that electricity peak management, which could really have a good impact, or at least help reduce some of those prices a bit. And the other part of that story in terms of gas versus electricity is the gas versus coal side of things. So obviously most electricity comes from coal, but you need to burn a heck of a lot of coal to get that electricity. And gas, for the most part, is used directly for energy. So gas actually provides quite a bit more energy to the economy than coal, but it doesn't produce the same amount of jobs. It doesn't have as much of an export industry. So there is a lot of attention on coal and saving Australia's coal industry in the future, particularly when we're introducing carbon prices and other climate change initiatives, but gas really does hold its own against coal in terms of contribution to the economy as well. So some of the issues facing the gas market, the export industry on the East Coast is going to create some big ones. It's going to at least double wholesale gas prices. It could well triple wholesale gas prices, which will lead to all sorts of anxiety and excitement among major gas users, in particular for the retail and in the home use. By the time you factor in transmission costs, retail costs, distribution costs, it's not a doubling or tripling. It will increase, but it's not as big a deal. But that's also, coal seam gas happens to be where a lot of people do farming. A lot of people have hobby farms in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, those kind of things, where there's good coal seam gas. So the gas industry is fighting a bit of a public perception battle at the moment as well. Probably another one to focus on is energy policy. There's a lot of policy about clean coal, maintaining Australia's coal industry, a lot of policy focused on renewable energy. The federal government and almost all state governments have no policy on natural gas. So that's something that is a concern for us. Could mean that natural gas won't play as big a role as it could have or should have in the future. And on to today's topic, we've got a big ageing workforce issue in the gas industry. It's probably a bit more pronounced than most places, and there's a few stories that go around of welders in particular on construction projects celebrating their 70th, 73rd birthday on the job. So the average age is right up there. In terms of workforce and training, with DEWA, EOS, ENA, LPGA and APIA got DEWA to conduct a survey of the gas industry. There wasn't good information, and that found that there's roughly 10,000 people in the transmission and distribution industry, sort of evenly split. The LPG industry wasn't well represented in that survey, so we don't have good numbers on that. And something that came out was that we're clearly on the wrong side of all the statistics pretty much. We're not bringing in enough young people, the average age is too old, and most companies seem to be more focused on poaching other people's players than training up and developing their own workforces. And look, part of that is the gas industry privatised quite a while ago, I think. So early 90s and mid 90s saw pretty much every asset in Australia is privatised. And one of the first things to go was comprehensive training programs in terms of private companies making the operations meaner and leaner, and they're starting to feel the bite on that now. There aren't really apprenticeships for the gas industry. The first apprenticeship was only approved this year in WA, so we're looking at really spreading that around the country in the short term. That will help bring in young people and can give us a more solid framework to focus on. There's very few RTOs with the gas package on scope. There's a handful of private trainers, a couple of TAFEs. The package is not highly usable. There's a major overhaul underway. It's slow going. We have some interesting discussions over and over. I'm sure those of you involved in tax are familiar with how those discussions work. And people come in and they're interested, but it's hard work, and so we get that cyclic enthusiasm as well. So it's really something we're working on and looking to develop a new package for the end of this year, pretty much. So look, that's a really, really quick look at the gas industry in Australia. Thank you very much for your time. I'm sorry to go a little bit over. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Steve.
Thanks, Phil.
Take that with our respects.
I will.
Thank you. We are a bit over time, so we will take a quick question, but that's not too many.
I know that ordinary transmission gas is methane, ethane. What's in coal seam gas?
Coal seam gas is pretty much pure methane.
Okay.
That was quick. Yeah. Oh, if we can have one just as quick.
Ashley Hartnell from Utility Train. Steve, just curious, I'm not sure if this is your area of expertise, but the new fiberglass pipelines, the glass pipelines that are going high pressure, do you know the future of that? Has that got a future in Australia, like it's taken off in America?
I have no idea, actually. It hasn't really been brought up with the Pipeline Industry Association much. The transmission lines, we're always focused on steel, so I couldn't answer that question.
Okay. One more here. Yep. With Bob.
Steve, it's not a Dorothy Dixer, but if you look at Gladstone and the new CNG plants and all the rest of it, is there any, you talk about training opportunities. Seems to me if we're going to get involved in coal seam gas export, etc., wouldn't it be reasonable to expect there'd be some apprenticeships and training be undertaken as part of those projects?
Yeah, there's a lot of interest from the coal seam gas companies about building up their workforce. I guess for the most part, and they have been reasonable at engaging with EOS and the tax that we have for the gas training package, but for the most part, they are upstream gas companies, so they are the producers, and they're looking at doing vertically integrated operations. They probably will, in time, hive off transmission operations and things. So there's definite opportunity there, and that's probably where we will see a better focus, particularly from, the Queensland government is obviously really interested and is putting together some sort of, petroleum and gas centre of excellence, but at this stage it's more focused on sort of the drilling and upstream elements, and the gas training package is focused on midstream and downstream, so it doesn't get into the upstream side of things. It's focused on transmission, distribution and LPG. But yeah, there's definite opportunities there, and it's a renewed interest.
Thanks, Steve. I think you've been able to garner the attention of an electrical-focused audience with the gas story. Well done. Good on you.
Phil.
Thanks, Steve Davies.